Hi, I'm Beth Walensky, Legal Practice Professor at the University of Michigan Law School. This video provides an introduction to CREAC, which is an acronym for the basic steps of legal analysis. Before you watch this video, you should make sure that you have reviewed the materials in the People v. Livingston case file. This video, and the ones that follow it, rely on those materials for the examples it uses. This is the first video in a series of 4 on CREAC. This video provides a broad overview of the pieces of legal analysis, and then the other videos will take you in depth on each of the major pieces. So here's what CREAC stands for. The C is for conclusion. The conclusion always comes first in legal analysis. Now that may be somewhat different from writing you've done in the past, but you should always keep in mind that attorneys and other legal audiences don't like to be kept in suspense. The conclusion comes first. Next is R, the rule. Then E, an explanation. A stands for application, and the last C stands for counter-analysis. Now, you should think of these pieces as the building blocks of legal analysis. By analogy, if you've ever played a musical instrument, you may be familiar with playing scales on an instrument. If you've played a piano, maybe you've played chords as a way to warm up your fingers. Chords and scales in music form the building blocks of all of music theory and just about any piece of music. And once you know them, you can mix up the pieces in many different ways. CREAC works similarly. At this point, it's essential to learn what the pieces are, what kind of background analysis goes into figuring out what to put in each piece, how to organize them, and why we use each piece. Once you have those essential building blocks down, you'll be able to, as the year goes on, learn different ways to organize them and emphasize different pieces. Now let's back up for a minute and talk about where your CREAC analysis fits in an overall discussion of a legal problem. So let's go back to People v. Livingston. Remember, our client, Julia Livingston, has been charged with aggravated assault. And we have been asked to determine and to write a memo on whether she has a valid claim of self-defense. We know from the Maine Supreme Court case from the Michigan Supreme Court that there are 4 elements she has to prove in order to have a valid claim of self-defense. If we were writing a memo, we would first have an introductory section where we would provide a brief overview of what those legal elements are. That's what I'm calling the background on the legal framework. Now, we're not going to worry too much about that today. We'll save discussion of that background section for another day. Right now, I want to focus on the individual legal elements that Julia Livingston has to establish. The first one, remember, is that the defendant had a reasonable belief of harm. The second element is that the harm was imminent. The third element is that the harm was significant enough to constitute great bodily harm. And the fourth is that deadly force was necessary to prevent that harm. So where does our CREAC analysis go in this overall discussion? For a memo like this, there would be 4 separate CREAC analyses, 1 for each of the elements. Now, some of the analyses will be longer than others, depending on how complicated the individual element is. But this is typically what we talk about when we're talking about CREAC, where it belongs in an overall analysis. If you had a question that involved multiple factors that courts weigh or balance, you would similarly have an individual CREAC analysis for each of those factors. Now let's look a little bit more in depth at what each step contains. So remember that first C is for conclusion. In this step, you just simply state the overall conclusion for the issue or for the element or the factor. The second step is the rule. You're going to state the legal rule that leads to your overall conclusion. The third step is what we call the explanation. And in this step, you explain or illustrate the rule using usually court opinions. The next step is the application. This is where you actually apply the rule to your client's situation by drawing on that case law you used in the explanation section. And finally, sometimes we have what's called a counter-analysis. That's when we consider and evaluate any arguments that might lead to the opposite conclusion and explain why, in fact, they would not lead to the opposite conclusion in this circumstance. Now let's look at an example. So remember, one of the elements that Julia Livingston has to prove is that the harm she feared was imminent. In other words, it can't be the case that she was worried that her roommate was going to go out of state to buy a vase to come back and throw it at her a week later. That clearly would not be imminent harm. So we need to figure out how close in time the harm she fears is in order for her to establish that this element is satisfied. This is what a CREAC analysis for that second element, imminence, might look like. We start with a conclusion. The conclusion is usually just one straightforward sentence, like it is here. Livingston will be able to establish that the harm she feared was imminent. If I thought that, based on my analysis, that she would not be able to satisfy this element, the conclusion would say that Livingston will not be able to establish that the harm she feared was imminent. Then we have a one-sentence statement of the rule. An action is imminent even where it is merely close rather than touching, or at least near at hand. Then we have two sentences that explain that rule using a court decision. For example, in Juneau, the victim had a gun strapped to his leg. The court held that the victim's ability to quickly reach down, grab the gun, and shoot it satisfied the imminence requirement. Then we have two sentences of application where I actually apply the element to my client's situation. Similarly here, while Manning did not yet have the vase in her hand, she was quite close to it when she stepped into the hallway. It would have taken a matter of seconds for her to grab the vase and throw it at Livingston. Therefore, this element is satisfied. You'll notice that in this example, there is no counter-analysis. That's not unusual at all, and in a later video, I'll talk a little bit about why that is. So that's it for a brief overview of CREAC. Now in the other videos, we'll go into depth on the major pieces of it so you can learn more about how to put it together. Thank you.